The tour bus hummed quietly along Interstate 35, carrying country music's most beloved icon toward what many considered the heart of Texas. George Strait sat in his favorite leather chair, guitar resting against his knee, watching the familiar landscape roll by through tinted windows. At 73, he had seen this road countless times, but tonight felt different. This wasn't just another stop on another tour. This was part of his farewell journey, a final tribute to the fans who had supported him for over 4 decades. "San Antonio in 2 hours, George," called out his tour manager, Jake Mitchell, from the front of the bus. "The Alamodome's sold out, 25,000 people waiting to hear you sing." George nodded, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. 25,000. He remembered when playing for 200 people felt like conquering the world. Now, as he prepared for what would likely be his final major tour, the numbers seemed almost surreal. But it wasn't the size of the crowds that moved him anymore. It was the stories, the connections, the lives that his music had somehow touched over the years. His phone buzzed with a text from his son, Bubba. "Dad, saw the news coverage of last night's show in Houston. Mom would have been proud." George's chest tightened slightly. Norma had been gone for 3 years now, and there wasn't a day that passed without him thinking about her. She had been his anchor, his voice of reason, and his biggest supporter. These final shows felt like a way of honoring her memory as much as celebrating his career. "You thinking about tomorrow's interview with that journalist?" asked his longtime friend and guitarist Tommy Rodriguez, settling into the seat across from him. "Daniel Hayes, right?" George replied, strumming a few chords absently. "Jake says he's been covering country music since the 80s, wants to do some kind of retrospective piece." "Those retrospective pieces always make you sound ancient," Tommy laughed. "Next thing you know, they'll be asking about the good old days when dinosaurs roamed the earth." George chuckled, but his mind was already drifting. Retrospectives meant looking back, remembering where it all started. And where it started was a long way from sold-out arenas and platinum albums. It started in a small classroom in Pearsall, Texas, where a young teacher with kind eyes and infinite patience had first encouraged a shy 8-year-old boy to believe in himself. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. Even now, decades later, he could picture her clearly. Petite frame, silver hair always perfectly arranged, and a smile that could make any student feel like they were capable of anything. She had been more than a teacher. She had been the first person outside his family to see something special in him, to nurture his love of music, and to teach him that dreams, no matter how big, were worth pursuing. The bus hit a small bump, bringing George back to the present. He wondered what had become of Mrs. Whitfield. It had been so many years since those early days in Pearsall. She would be in her 90s now if she was still alive. The thought sent a pang of regret through him. In all his success, all his achievements, he had never properly thanked the woman who had planted the first seeds of confidence in his young heart. "George, you okay?" Tommy asked, noticing his friend's distant expression. "Just thinking about old times," George replied softly. "Sometimes I wonder about the people who helped shape who I became, you know, the ones who believed in me before I even believed in myself." Tommy nodded knowingly. They had been friends for over 30 years, and he had heard George talk about his childhood influences before. There was always a special reverence in his voice when he mentioned his early teachers, particularly one from his elementary school days. As the bus continued its journey toward San Antonio, George found himself remembering specific moments from Mrs. Whitfield's classroom. The day she had caught him humming during math class and instead of scolding him, had asked him to share the song with everyone. The afternoon she had stayed after school to help him with a reading assignment, patiently working with him until he conquered the difficult words. The Christmas program, where she had given him a small solo, his first real performance in front of an audience. Those memories felt more precious now than any award he had ever received. Mrs. Whitfield had seen potential in a quiet, sometimes struggling student, and had nurtured it with the kind of dedication that true educators possess. She had taught him that making mistakes was part of learning, that practice made perfect, and that kindness was just as important as knowledge. The irony wasn't lost on him that here he was, at the pinnacle of his career, thinking not about the accolades or the fame, but about an elementary school teacher who had probably forgotten him long ago. Or maybe she hadn't. Maybe she had followed his career, proud of the little boy who had grown up to touch so many lives with his music. George pulled out his phone and, on impulse, started typing a note to himself. "Find Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, Pearsall Elementary." Then he stopped. What would he even say after all these years? How do you thank someone for something that happened over 60 years ago, something they probably didn't even realize they had done? The bus began to slow as they approached the outskirts of San Antonio. George could see the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance, and he knew that soon he would be consumed with sound checks, meet and greets, and the familiar pre-show routine that had become second nature to him. But for now, in the quiet of the tour bus, he allowed himself to remain in those childhood memories, honoring the woman who had helped set him on this incredible journey. Tomorrow's interview with Daniel Hayes would probably cover the usual topics: his biggest hits, his influences, his legacy in country music. But George found himself hoping that somehow the conversation might drift toward those early days in Pearsall, toward the teachers and mentors who had shaped not just his career, but his character. Because in the end, that's what really mattered. Not just the music he had made, but the people who had helped him become the man who could make that music. As the Alamodome came into view, George whispered a small prayer of gratitude for Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, wherever she might be, hoping that somehow she knew how much her kindness had meant to a shy little boy who had grown up to be the king of country music. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the small house on Mesquite Street in Pearsall, Texas, casting gentle shadows across the worn hardwood floors. Eleanor Catherine Whitfield moved slowly but deliberately through her morning routine, her 91-year-old hands steady as she prepared her single cup of coffee. The house, which had once buzzed with the energy of her late husband Robert and their frequent visits from students and colleagues, now held only her memories and the quiet comfort of a life well lived. Eleanor settled into her favorite armchair, the one Robert had bought her for their 40th anniversary, and reached for the morning newspaper. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but she refused to give up this daily ritual. Reading had always been her passion, from her early days as a young teacher fresh out of college to her 43-year career in the Pearsall Independent School District. The financial section made her frown slightly. Her teacher's pension, modest to begin with, seemed to stretch thinner each year. The cost of her medications had increased again, and the roof repair she had been putting off would have to wait another month. But Eleanor had learned long ago to focus on what she had, rather than what she lacked. She had her health, mostly. She had her mind, sharp as ever. And she had her memories, thousands of them, each representing a young life she had been privileged to touch. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Rebecca Ann Foster, the young nurse from the community health center who had been checking on her since her last bout with pneumonia 6 months ago. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield," Rebecca said as Eleanor opened the door. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I'm 91 years old, dear, but grateful for it," Eleanor replied with a smile that still held the warmth that had comforted thousands of children over the decades. Come in, come in. I just made coffee." Rebecca had started visiting Eleanor as part of her job, but over time, their relationship had evolved into something closer to friendship. At 34, Rebecca was young enough to be Eleanor's granddaughter, but she possessed an old soul and a genuine interest in Eleanor's stories about her teaching days. "I brought you something," Rebecca said, pulling a magazine from her bag. "It's an article about George Strait. Didn't you tell me once that you taught him when he was little?" Eleanor's eyes lit up as she took the magazine. The cover featured a recent photo of George, now silver-haired but still handsome, with the headline, "The King of Country's Final Tour." She traced his face gently with her finger, and for a moment she was transported back to 1959, seeing not the famous entertainer but the shy 8-year-old boy who used to hum quietly during arithmetic lessons. "George Harvey Strait," she said softly, using his full name as she had when he was her student. "Goodness, how time flies. He was in my 3rd grade class, you know. Such a sweet boy, but so quiet." His family had just moved to Pearsall, and he was having trouble adjusting. Rebecca settled into the chair across from Eleanor, fascinated as always by these glimpses into her friend's past. What was he like as a student? Eleanor's face took on the gentle expression she always wore when remembering her students. Academically, he struggled a bit at first. Reading didn't come easily to him, and he was self-conscious about it. But oh, that child had music in his soul, even then. I would catch him humming the most beautiful melodies, songs I had never heard before. When I asked him about them, he would blush and say he just made them up. She paused to sip her coffee, lost in the memory. One day, during our Christmas program practice, I heard him singing quietly to himself. While the other children were being fitted for their costumes, his voice was so pure, so natural, I knew immediately that he had a gift. "Did you encourage his music?" Rebecca asked. "I tried to, within the confines of what a 3rd grade teacher could do," Eleanor replied. "I gave him small solos in our class programs, asked him to lead the singing of Happy Birthday for classmates. Little things, but I could see how they built his confidence. His reading improved too, once he started believing in himself more." Eleanor opened the magazine and began reading the article. It detailed George's latest tour, described by many as his farewell to live performance. She read about the sold-out arenas, the millions of records sold, the Country Music Hall of Fame induction, and the countless awards. But what struck her most was a quote from George himself. "I've been blessed to do what I love for a living, and I've never forgotten that it all started with people who believed in me before I believed in myself." "He's coming to San Antonio," Rebecca noted, reading over Eleanor's shoulder. "The Alamodome next week. Tickets are probably expensive, but wouldn't it be amazing if you could see him perform?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh dear, I think those days are behind me. Can you imagine? A 91-year-old woman at a country music concert. Besides, I'm sure tickets cost more than I spend on groceries in a month." But even as she said it, something stirred inside her. The idea of seeing little George Harvey, now the internationally famous George Strait, perform felt like completing a circle somehow. She had often wondered over the years what had become of all her students. Some she had kept track of through the small-town network of news and gossip. Many had become teachers themselves, doctors, mechanics, farmers, mothers and fathers, raising their own children in the same community where she had taught them. But George had become something beyond what anyone in Pearsall could have imagined. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rebecca said carefully, "what if I told you that I think you should go to that concert?" Eleanor looked at her with surprise. "Rebecca, honey, I appreciate the thought, but—" "No, listen to me," Rebecca interrupted gently. "You spent 43 years giving pieces of your heart to every child who walked into your classroom. You inspired them, encouraged them, believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. Don't you think you deserve to see the fruit of one of those investments?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering Rebecca's words. It was true that she had never asked for recognition or thanks from her former students. Teaching had been its own reward. But there was something appealing about the idea of seeing George perform, of witnessing firsthand what that shy little boy had become. "The tickets, Rebecca. I simply can't afford—" "What if I helped?" Rebecca offered. My grandmother left me a little money when she passed last year. She was a teacher too, and I think she would love the idea of helping another teacher see her former student succeed." Eleanor felt tears welling up in her eyes. The kindness of this young woman, who had already given her so much friendship and care, overwhelmed her. But the practical side of her mind, honed by years of living on a teacher's salary and then a teacher's pension, couldn't quite accept such generosity. "You're very sweet, dear, but I couldn't let you do that." Rebecca stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where Eleanor had lived for over 50 years. "Mrs. Whitfield, can I tell you something? When I was going through nursing school, I was ready to quit about halfway through. The coursework was hard, the clinical rotations were exhausting, and I was working 2 part-time jobs to pay for everything. I felt like I wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough to become a nurse." She turned back to Eleanor. "Then I met an elderly patient, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson. She was in her 80s and had been hospitalized for pneumonia, just like you were. But instead of feeling sorry for herself, she spent every day encouraging the staff, asking about our lives, telling us we were capable of great things. She reminded me why I wanted to become a nurse in the first place, to help people, to make a difference." Rebecca's voice grew softer. "Mrs. Patterson passed away before I graduated, but her belief in me got me through. When I met you, I saw the same spirit, the same gift for encouraging others. You've been doing what she did for me for over 40 years, for thousands of students. If George Strait became who he is, partly because of your influence, then seeing him perform isn't just entertainment. It's a celebration of the life you've lived and the difference you've made." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. The idea of seeing George perform was beginning to feel less like an impossible dream and more like an adventure worth taking. "Rebecca, are you certain about this? It's not just the ticket. I would need transportation, and I'm not sure I can manage standing in crowds or walking long distances anymore." "We'll figure it all out," Rebecca said firmly. "My brother lives in San Antonio. He can help us with transportation and navigation. As for standing and walking, we'll get seats, and I'll be right there with you." Eleanor looked down at the magazine again, at the picture of George on stage, guitar in hand, thousands of fans singing along to his songs. She thought about that little boy who used to hum during math class, who had struggled with reading but whose face would light up whenever music was mentioned. She thought about all the students she had taught over the years, wondering what they had become, hoping that she had made some small positive difference in their lives. "All right," she said quietly, then louder and more decisively. "All right, let's do it. Let's go see what George Harvey Strait has become." Rebecca's face broke into a huge smile. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it," Eleanor said, feeling more energized than she had in months. "But I have one condition. Anything. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. I want to wear my best dress, the blue one with the pearl buttons that Robert always said made me look distinguished, and I want to take something with me." "What's that?" Eleanor stood up slowly and walked to an old trunk in the corner of her living room. From it, she pulled out a carefully preserved school photograph from 1959. There, in the second row, third from the left, was 8-year-old George Strait, gap-toothed smile and cowlick, surrounded by his classmates. "I want to take this," she said, "just in case." Just in case of what? Neither of them could say. But both women felt that this concert was going to be more than just an evening of entertainment. It was going to be a reunion 65 years in the making, a chance for a devoted teacher to see the magnificent man her student had become. And perhaps, if the stars aligned just right, an opportunity to complete a circle that had begun in a small classroom in Pearsall, Texas, when a young teacher first heard a shy boy humming and recognized the music in his soul. The Alamodome buzzed with anticipation as 25,000 country music fans filled the massive venue. It was October 15th, a crisp autumn evening in San Antonio, and the energy in the air was palpable. This wasn't just another concert. Everyone knew they were witnessing history, one of George Strait's final performances before he stepped away from touring forever. Eleanor Whitfield sat in her seat, Section 104, Row 12, Seat 8, clutching her small purse that contained the 1959 class photograph. At 91, the enormity of the venue initially overwhelmed her. The lights, the noise, the sheer number of people. It was unlike anything she had experienced. But Rebecca Ann Foster sat beside her, holding her hand reassuringly and pointing out different aspects of the stage setup. "The sound check was incredible, Mrs. Whitfield," Rebecca's brother, Michael Foster, said as he returned to his seat with bottled water for both women. "I've been to a lot of concerts, but there's something special about tonight. You can feel it." Eleanor nodded, though her mind was racing. Part of her wondered what she was doing here, a retired schoolteacher in an arena full of people a fraction of her age. But another part of her, the part that had spent 4 decades nurturing young minds and believing in their potential, felt exactly where she belonged. Meanwhile, backstage, George Strait was going through his pre-show routine. He had performed this ritual thousands of times. Vocal warm-ups, equipment checks, a quiet moment of prayer, and a final review of the setlist with his band. But tonight felt different. The interview with journalist Daniel Robert Hayes that afternoon had unexpectedly stirred up memories of his childhood, particularly his early school days in Pearsall. "George, 5 minutes," his stage manager announced. Daniel Hayes approached with his notebook. "I wanted to thank you again for this afternoon's interview. Your comments about your early influences, especially that teacher you mentioned, Mrs. Whitfield, really resonated with me. There's something beautiful about remembering the people who believed in us before we made it big." George nodded, adjusting his signature cowboy hat. "She was special. I've been thinking about her a lot lately, wondering what became of her. I should have reached out years ago." "It's never too late," Daniel suggested. "Maybe after the tour, you could visit Pearsall, see if anyone remembers her." 2 minutes, George." The conversation ended as George prepared to take the stage, but Daniel's words echoed in his mind. It really wasn't too late. Maybe it was time to track down Mrs. Whitfield and properly thank her for the gift she had given him so many years ago. The lights dimmed and the crowd erupted as George Strait walked onto the stage. From her seat, Eleanor could barely make out his figure at first. He seemed so small from this distance, but when he stepped up to the microphone and began to sing Heartland, his voice filled every corner of the massive arena, clear and strong, and unmistakably the same voice that had hummed in her third-grade classroom all those years ago. "Oh my," Eleanor whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. "That's really him. That's really George Harvey." Rebecca squeezed her hand. "How does it feel seeing him up there?" Eleanor couldn't speak for a moment. Watching George command the stage with such confidence and grace, seeing the joy on the faces of thousands of fans singing along to his songs, was overwhelming. This was her student, the shy boy who had struggled with reading, who had been afraid to raise his hand in class, who had needed encouragement to believe in himself. The concert was everything Eleanor had hoped it would be, and more. George performed his greatest hits. Amarillo Morning, All My Exes Live in Texas, The Chair, Check, Yes or No. Each song brought back memories of the boy she had known, but she was also discovering the artist he had become. His stage presence was commanding yet humble, his interaction with the audience genuine and warm. During I Cross My Heart, Eleanor found herself crying openly, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of pride and completion. This magnificent performer, this man who had touched millions of lives with his music, had once been her student. She had played a small part in nurturing the confidence that now allowed him to stand before all these people and share his gift. After 90 minutes of an incredible performance, George began to slow things down for what appeared to be the final portion of the show. The crowd was on its feet, knowing the evening was coming to an end, but not wanting it to be over. "Folks," George said into the microphone, "before we finish up tonight, I want to talk to you about something. This afternoon I did an interview with a journalist, and he got me thinking about the people who helped shape who I am. You know, we all have people in our lives who believed in us before we had any reason to believe in ourselves." The arena grew quieter, people leaning in to listen. "When I was 8 years old, growing up in Pearsall, Texas, I had a third-grade teacher named Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. I was a shy kid, struggled with reading, didn't have much confidence. But Mrs. Whitfield saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She encouraged my love of music, gave me chances to sing in class programs, and most importantly, she taught me that it was okay to be different, that having a dream was worth pursuing." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. Rebecca gripped her arm, both women staring at the stage in disbelief. "I've been thinking about Mrs. Whitfield a lot lately," George continued, "wondering what became of her, wishing I had thanked her properly for the gift she gave me. If she's still out there somewhere, I hope she knows that every song I've ever sung, every dream I've ever achieved, started in her classroom with her belief in a little boy who just wanted to make music." The crowd applauded warmly, moved by George's heartfelt words, but Eleanor was shaking, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement she had never expected or sought. "We have to tell him," Rebecca whispered urgently. "Mrs. Whitfield, we have to let him know you're here." Eleanor shook her head, too emotional to speak clearly. The idea of somehow getting George's attention in this massive crowd seemed impossible and presumptuous. But Michael Foster was already on his feet. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice somehow carrying over the noise. "Hey, George! She's here! Mrs. Whitfield is here!" Other people around them began to take notice. When they realized what was happening, that George Strait's childhood teacher was actually in the audience, they began to join in, pointing toward Eleanor's section and shouting. On stage, George initially looked confused by the commotion in one section of the arena. His security team was already moving toward the area, thinking there might be some kind of disturbance. But then he heard it clearly. "Mrs. Whitfield is here. Your teacher is here." George stopped mid-sentence, staring out into the crowd. "What did you say?" he asked into the microphone. The crowd in section 104 was now on its feet, all pointing toward Eleanor, who sat frozen in her seat, simultaneously terrified and amazed by what was happening. "George!" Michael Foster shouted again. "Your third-grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. She's right here." George handed his guitar to a band member and walked to the edge of the stage, shielding his eyes against the stage lights as he tried to see into the crowd. "Are you serious? Mrs. Whitfield is here?" The crowd began to chant, "Mrs. Whitfield, Mrs. Whitfield." The entire arena had become invested in this moment, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Ma'am," George called out, "if you're really Mrs. Whitfield, if you're really here, could you stand up? Could you let me see you?" Rebecca helped Eleanor to her feet, who, despite her age and the overwhelming nature of the situation, Eleanor Whitfield stood tall, her dignity and grace evident even from a distance. She pulled the class photograph from her purse and held it up, though George couldn't possibly see it from the stage. George stared out at the elderly woman, standing in section 104, and even across the vast distance, something in his heart recognized her. The posture, the way she carried herself, the simple dignity that had made her so beloved by generations of students. "Oh my God," he whispered into the microphone. "Oh my God, it's really her." What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts and social media for weeks to come. George Strait, the king of country music, began to cry on stage in front of 25,000 people. Not just a few tears, but the deep emotional crying of a man who had just received an impossible gift. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said through his tears, "I can't believe you're here. I just can't believe it." The arena fell silent except for George's voice. Even the band members were wiping their eyes, understanding that they were part of something remarkable. "Security!" George called out. "Please, please, bring her backstage. Bring her to me. Mrs. Whitfield, if you're able, if you're willing, would you come see me? Would you let me thank you properly after all these years?" Eleanor looked at Rebecca, who nodded encouragingly. "Can you do it, Mrs. Whitfield? Can you go see him?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible, but her words were clear. "Yes. Oh yes, I can do it." As security personnel began making their way through the crowd to escort Eleanor backstage, George turned back to his audience. "Folks, I hope you'll understand if we take a few minutes here. This is Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, my third-grade teacher from Pearsall, Texas. She's 91 years old, and she's here tonight, and I can't." He stopped, too overcome with emotion to continue. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that lasted several minutes. They were applauding not just for Eleanor, but for every teacher who had ever believed in a student, for every act of kindness that had changed a life, for the beautiful reminder that success is built on the foundation of people who care. Eleanor made her way slowly through the crowd, assisted by security and Rebecca, who refused to leave her side. As she walked, people reached out to touch her hand, to thank her, to tell her they were teachers too, or that they remembered a special teacher from their own childhood. Backstage was a blur of activity, but when Eleanor finally reached the area behind the stage, everything seemed to slow down. And there, walking toward her, was George Harvey Strait. No longer the shy 8-year-old boy she remembered, but somehow, in his eyes and in his smile, still recognizably her student. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said softly, taking off his hat as he approached her. "I cannot believe you're here. I simply cannot believe it." "Hello, George Harvey," Eleanor replied, using his full name as she always had. "My goodness, look at you. Look what you've become." And then they were embracing, teacher and student, 91 and 71, brought together by the threads of memory and the power of gratitude. Around them, band members, crew, and the few people allowed in the area stood watching in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and beautiful. "I have something for you," Eleanor said, reaching into her purse with shaking hands. She pulled out the class photograph from 1959. "I brought this, hoping, well, I don't know what I was hoping." George took the photograph with reverence, staring at the young faces, finding himself in the second row, remembering that day when Mrs. Whitfield had lined them all up for the picture. "You kept this all these years?" "I kept pictures of all my classes," Eleanor replied, "but this one was special because of you, because of what you became. George Harvey, I want you to know that I followed your career. I bought your albums. I watched you on television. I was so proud of you, so proud of the man you became." George was crying again, but these were tears of joy, of completion, of a gratitude so deep he could barely express it. "Mrs. Whitfield, everything I've achieved, everything I've become, started with you believing in me. You taught me to believe in myself, to pursue my dreams, to understand that being different wasn't something to hide, but something to celebrate." They talked for 20 minutes backstage, about his childhood, about her other students, about the changes in education, about life and loss and the passage of time. But mostly, they talked about that third-grade classroom where a shy boy had first learned to believe in his own voice. Finally, George asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment he saw her in the audience. "Mrs. Whitfield, would you do me the honor of coming back out on stage with me?" Would you let me introduce you properly to these people? They need to see you, to thank you for what you've given to the world." Eleanor hesitated. At 91, the idea of appearing on stage in front of 25,000 people was daunting. But Rebecca, who had remained quietly by her side through the entire encounter, whispered, "You've spent your whole life encouraging others to be brave. Now it's your turn." "All right, George Harvey," Eleanor said, with the same gentle smile that had encouraged thousands of students over the years. "Let's go show them what a teacher looks like." Walking back onto the stage together, George supporting Eleanor's arm, they were greeted by the most thunderous applause either of them had ever heard. The entire arena was on its feet, many people crying, all of them understanding that they were witnessing a moment that transcended entertainment and touched something fundamental about human connection and gratitude. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said into the microphone, his voice strong and clear, "I want you to meet Mrs. Eleanor Catherine Whitfield, my third-grade teacher, who taught me that dreams are worth pursuing and that believing in yourself is the first step toward achieving anything. She's 91 years old and she came here tonight to see what became of one of her students." The applause was deafening. Eleanor stepped up to the microphone, her voice still clear and strong despite her age. "Thank you all for this incredible welcome. I want you to know that George Harvey was always special, but he's become something beyond what any of us in Pearsall ever imagined. I'm proud of the artist he became, but I'm even more proud of the man he became. And I want to remind all of you that somewhere out there you have teachers who believed in you too. Don't forget to thank them." As Eleanor stepped back, George began to sing "Amazing Grace," his voice carrying across the silent arena. But halfway through the first verse, something magical happened. Eleanor, standing beside him, began to sing harmony in a clear, sweet voice that blended perfectly with his. It was the same voice that had led countless children in songs during Christmas programs and daily morning exercises, now joining with her former student in a moment of pure, transcendent beauty. When the song ended, the arena erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. George and Eleanor embraced once more, teacher and student, their reunion complete. As Eleanor left the stage, assisted by Rebecca and still clutching the class photograph, George finished his concert with "I Cross My Heart," dedicating it to every teacher who has ever seen potential in a child and nurtured it with love and patience. De si de tos murmur a de si tuon. Later, as Eleanor settled into Rebecca's car for the drive back to Pearsall, she felt a completeness she hadn't experienced in years. She had seen her student achieve greatness, had been acknowledged for her small part in that achievement, and had been reminded that the work she had done for 43 years had mattered more than she had ever known. The concert had ended, but the story was just beginning. Within hours, videos of the reunion were spreading across social media, news outlets were picking up the story, and America was falling in love with the 91-year-old teacher who had helped shape one of country music's greatest stars. But for Eleanor Whitfield, the real reward wasn't the attention or the accolades. It was the look in George Harvey's eyes when he saw her, the gratitude in his voice when he thanked her, and the knowledge that somewhere in a third-grade classroom in Pearsall, Texas, she had planted a seed that had grown into something beautiful and lasting. The circle was complete, but the ripples from this reunion were just beginning to spread. The morning after the concert, Eleanor Whitfield woke up in her small house on Mesquite Street to find her life completely transformed. Her landline had been ringing since 6 a.m., Rebecca was fielding calls on her cell phone, and when Eleanor peeked through her front window, she saw news vans lining her quiet street. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rebecca said, hanging up from yet another call, "that was Good Morning America. They want to interview you." And before that it was the Today Show, CNN, and something called Entertainment Tonight. Eleanor sat in her armchair, still in her robe, trying to process what was happening. Yesterday, she had been a retired teacher living quietly in a small Texas town. Today, apparently, she was famous. "I don't understand," Eleanor said softly. "What do they want with me?" Rebecca sat down beside her, pulling up videos on her phone. "Mrs. Whitfield, look at this. The video of you and George singing Amazing Grace together has been viewed over 2 million times since last night. People are calling it the most beautiful moment they've ever seen at a concert." Eleanor watched the phone screen, seeing herself standing next to George on that enormous stage, their voices blending in harmony. Even she had to admit it was moving. But what struck her most was the expression on George's face, pure joy and gratitude that reminded her so much of the little boy she had once known. "And look at these comments," Rebecca continued, scrolling through hundreds of responses. "People are sharing stories about their own favorite teachers. They're saying you represent everything good about education, about the impact teachers have on their students' lives." A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Through the window, Eleanor could see it wasn't another reporter. It was Margaret Louise Patterson, her former colleague and longtime friend, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the biggest smile Eleanor had seen in years. "Margaret!" Eleanor exclaimed as she opened the door. "What are you doing here so early?" "Eleanor Catherine Whitfield," Margaret said, setting down the casserole and embracing her friend. "You have made every teacher in America proud. When I saw you on that stage last night, I cried like a baby. We all did." Margaret had taught alongside Eleanor for 25 years before retiring herself. At 87, she was still sharp and energetic, and she had always been Eleanor's closest confidant in the education world. "I brought you breakfast," Margaret continued, "because I figured you haven't had time to eat with all this commotion, and I brought you something else." She pulled a newspaper from under her arm, the San Antonio Express-News. The front page featured a large photo of Eleanor and George embracing on stage, with the headline, "Teachers Reunion, 91-year-old educator reminds America why teachers matter." Eleanor stared at the photograph, hardly believing that was really her on the front page of a major newspaper. The article, written by Daniel Robert Hayes, the same journalist who had interviewed George the day before, told the complete story of their reunion, but also delved into Eleanor's teaching career and the impact she had on countless students over the decades. "Daniel Hayes called me this morning," Margaret explained. "He wants to write a follow-up story about your teaching methods, about what made you so special as an educator. Eleanor, honey, this is bigger than just you and George. This is about recognizing what teachers do, how they shape the future." Rebecca's phone rang again. This time it was someone from George Strait's management company. After a brief conversation, she hung up with an expression of amazement. "Mrs. Whitfield, that was George's people. He wants to know if you would be willing to appear with him on a few television interviews this week. He says he wants to use this opportunity to highlight the importance of teachers and education funding." Eleanor felt overwhelmed. "I'm just a retired teacher from a small town. I don't know anything about television interviews or being in the spotlight." "But that's exactly why this is so powerful," Margaret said firmly. "You're not a celebrity or a politician with an agenda. You're a real teacher who made a real difference. People see authenticity in you, Eleanor. They see the kind of teacher they remember from their own childhood." Over the next few hours, the phone calls continued. But they weren't just from media outlets. Former students from across Eleanor's 43-year career began reaching out. The Pearsall Independent School District called to express their pride and ask if they could name the elementary school library after her. The Texas State Teachers Association wanted to give her a Lifetime Achievement Award. Most touching of all were the personal messages. James Robert Mitchell, who had been in her 5th grade class in 1967 and was now a successful doctor in Houston, called to tell her she had inspired him to pursue medicine. Linda Sue Rodriguez, from her 1978 fourth grade class, had become a teacher herself and credited Eleanor with showing her what education could be. Dozens of former students shared similar stories, how Eleanor had believed in them during difficult times, how her encouragement had changed the trajectory of their lives. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rebecca said after fielding another call, "that was a producer from 60 Minutes. They want to do a segment about the reunion, but also about the broader issue of teacher appreciation and education funding. They want to follow you for a few days, maybe visit some of your former students." Eleanor looked around her small living room, now filled with flowers and gifts from well-wishers, and tried to imagine television crews following her around. It seemed surreal, but she was beginning to understand that this moment was about more than just her reunion with George. "Margaret," she asked her longtime friend, "what do you think? Should I do these interviews?" Margaret took Eleanor's hands in hers. "Eleanor, in all my years of teaching, I never saw anyone connect with students the way you did. You had a gift for seeing potential in every child, for making them believe they could achieve anything. If sharing your story now can remind America how important teachers are, if it can inspire more people to support education or even become teachers themselves, then yes, I think you should do it." That afternoon, Eleanor agreed to her first television interview. The crew from Good Morning America drove down from Dallas, setting up cameras in her living room and asking her to tell the story of her reunion with George. But the interview quickly evolved into something deeper. "Mrs. Whitfield," the interviewer asked, "what was it about George Strait as a student that made you believe he had something special?" Eleanor thought carefully before answering. "George was struggling academically when he first came to my class. His family had moved several times, and he was behind in reading. But during quiet work time, I would hear him humming these beautiful melodies. When I asked him about them, he would tell me he just made them up in his head." She paused, her eyes taking on that distant look that came whenever she remembered her students. "One day, I kept him after school to help with his reading. He was getting frustrated, feeling like he wasn't smart enough. I told him that everyone has different kinds of intelligence, different gifts. I said, 'George Harvey, you may struggle with these words on the page, but you have music in your soul. That's a gift not everyone has.' And that made a difference?" "It seemed to," Eleanor replied. "Once he started believing that being different wasn't being deficient, his confidence grew. And when his confidence grew, his reading improved. By the end of third grade, he was performing at grade level. But more importantly, he was beginning to believe in himself." The interview aired the next morning, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Teachers from across the country began sharing their own stories of students they had encouraged, of moments when they had seen potential and nurtured it. Parents wrote to thank Eleanor for reminding them of their own children's teachers. Education advocates used Eleanor's story to highlight the need for better teacher pay and support. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from George himself. He called Eleanor personally that evening, his voice filled with emotion. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've been watching all these interviews, reading all these stories, and I keep thinking about what you said, that everyone has different kinds of intelligence, different gifts. Do you know that I've carried those words with me my entire career?" Eleanor felt tears welling up. "George Harvey, I probably said similar things to hundreds of students over the years. It was just what they needed to hear." "But that's exactly the point," George replied. "You saw what each student needed and you gave it to them. You didn't just teach curriculum, you taught children. You taught them to believe in themselves." George paused, then continued with obvious emotion in his voice. "Mrs. Whitfield, I want to do something. I want to establish a scholarship fund in your name for students who are struggling academically but show potential in other areas: music, art, athletics, leadership. I want to help kids like I was, kids who just need someone to believe in them." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture. "George Harvey, that's very kind, but you don't need to." "Yes, I do need to," he interrupted gently. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone can give a child. You helped me believe in myself. Now I want to pay that forward. Will you let me do this? Will you help me choose the recipients each year?" Through her tears, Eleanor managed to say yes. The Eleanor Whitfield Foundation was announced a week later, with George contributing the initial $1 million endowment. The foundation would provide scholarships and support for students who showed promise in non-traditional areas, helping them develop their talents while also building academic confidence. But the ripple effects of Eleanor's story continued to spread. Teachers' unions reported a surge in applications from people wanting to enter the profession. Education funding became a more prominent topic in political discussions. Schools across the country began implementing programs to recognize teachers who went above and beyond for their students. Eleanor found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to start. Letters poured in from teachers who felt newly appreciated, from students who were inspired to thank their own teachers, from parents who better understood the crucial role educators played in their children's lives. "I never imagined," Eleanor told Rebecca one evening, as they sorted through the hundreds of letters and gifts that continued to arrive, "that sharing my story would touch so many people." "That's because your story isn't really just about you and George," Rebecca replied. "It's about every teacher who has ever seen potential in a struggling student, every educator who has stayed late to help a child who needed extra attention, every person who chose teaching because they wanted to make a difference." Rebecca held up a letter from a young woman in Oregon. "Listen to this one. Dear Mrs. Whitfield, watching your reunion with George Strait made me realize I never thanked my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Johnson, who helped me overcome my shyness. I found her contact information and called her yesterday. We both cried. Thank you for reminding me that teachers are heroes too." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "Every day I receive letters like this. Stories of people reconnecting with their teachers, thanking them for kindnesses they thought had been forgotten. If that's all that comes from this experience, it will have been worth it." But there was more to come. Educational researchers began studying Eleanor's teaching methods, particularly her ability to identify and nurture different types of intelligence in her students. Universities started inviting her to speak to future teachers about creating inclusive, encouraging classroom environments. The most significant moment came when Eleanor was invited to address the National Education Association's annual convention. Standing before 5,000 educators from across the country, she spoke without notes, drawing on 43 years of experience and wisdom. "Teaching," she told the assembled crowd, "is not about imparting information. It's about recognizing the unique potential in every child and helping them discover it themselves. Every student who walks into your classroom is someone's whole world. They carry dreams and fears and hopes, and for the time they are with you, you have the privilege of nurturing all of it." The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but what moved Eleanor most were the conversations afterward. Young teachers thanked her for reminding them why they had chosen education. Veteran educators shared stories of their own struggling students who had gone on to achieve great things. Administrators talked about creating more supportive environments for both teachers and students. A month after the reunion, George invited Eleanor to visit his ranch outside San Antonio. It was a quiet afternoon, just the two of them sitting on his porch, looking out over the Texas landscape they both loved. "Mrs. Whitfield," George said, "I've been thinking a lot about that day in your classroom when you told me I had music in my soul. Do you remember what else you said?" Eleanor smiled. "I probably said a lot of things over the years, George Harvey. You'll have to remind me. You said, music is meant to be shared. Don't keep it locked up inside where no one can hear it." I think about those words every time I step on stage, every time I record a song. You taught me that my gift wasn't meant just for me, it was meant to bring joy to others." Eleanor reached over and patted his hand. "And look how many people you've brought joy to. Millions and millions of people have been touched by your music, George Harvey. That shy little boy who was afraid to sing in front of the class has shared his gift with the world." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, teacher and student, watching the sun set over the Texas hills. Finally, George spoke again. "You know what the best part of all this has been? Not the media attention or the foundation or any of that. It's been seeing the look on teachers' faces when they realize that their work matters, that they're making a difference even when they can't see it immediately." Eleanor nodded. "That's always been the challenge of teaching. You plant seeds, but you don't always get to see the harvest. Most teachers go their entire careers wondering if they really made a difference." "Well," George said, standing up and offering Eleanor his arm, "I hope our story has shown at least a few teachers that their work matters more than they know." As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had lived to see not just what one of her students had become, but how their reunion had reminded an entire nation of the importance of teachers and education. The shy boy who had once hummed during math class had indeed shared his gift with the world, and now, together, they were sharing the gift of recognition and appreciation for educators everywhere. The circle that had begun in a small classroom in Pearsall, Texas, had grown to encompass millions of people, all connected by the simple truth that teachers matter, that belief in a child can change the world, and that gratitude expressed has the power to transform lives. 6 months after the reunion that captured America's heart, Eleanor Whitfield's life had settled into a new rhythm, though it bore little resemblance to the quiet retirement she had known before that October evening at the Alamodome. Her small house on Mesquite Street had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for teachers, former students, and people inspired by her story. Eleanor sat in her garden on a warm spring morning, tending to the roses that Robert had planted for her 20 years earlier. At 91, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind remained sharp, and her spirit seemed rejuvenated by the events of recent months. Rebecca Ann Foster, who had become not just a friend but like family, was helping her prepare for what would be one of the most significant days of her life. "The car will be here in an hour, Mrs. Whitfield," Rebecca said, bringing Eleanor a cup of tea. "Are you nervous about the ceremony?" Eleanor smiled, the same gentle expression that had comforted thousands of students over the decades. "Nervous isn't the right word, dear. Grateful, maybe, overwhelmed by the kindness of it all." Today was the dedication of the Eleanor Whitfield Elementary School in Pearsall, the same building where she had taught for most of her career. The school district, with funding support from George Strait and the foundation he had established in Eleanor's honor, had completely renovated the facility, creating a state-of-the-art learning environment while preserving the warmth and community feel that had always characterized education in their small town. But the school dedication was only part of today's events. George had organized what he called a celebration of teaching, bringing together Eleanor's former students, colleagues, and education leaders from across Texas to honor not just Eleanor, but all the teachers who had dedicated their lives to nurturing young minds. The phone rang, and Rebecca answered it with the efficiency of someone who had become Eleanor's unofficial assistant and protector. Mrs. Whitfield, that was the producer from the documentary crew. They're ready to start filming the final interviews this afternoon. The documentary, tentatively titled The Teacher and the King, had been in production for months, following Eleanor's story and its impact on education advocacy across America. The filmmakers had interviewed dozens of Eleanor's former students, traced George's career from those early days in her classroom to his status as country music royalty, and explored how their reunion had sparked a national conversation about the value of teachers. You know, Rebecca, Eleanor said thoughtfully, when I was a young teacher, fresh out of college, I thought success meant having all my students pass their tests and move on to the next grade. I never imagined that success might mean touching lives in ways I would never know about, planting seeds that would grow decades later into something beautiful. Rebecca sat down beside Eleanor, both women comfortable with the silence that had become natural between them. Their friendship, born from Rebecca's professional duty to check on Eleanor's health, had evolved into something deeper, a connection between generations, with Eleanor serving as the grandmother Rebecca had lost years earlier, and Rebecca providing the family connection Eleanor had never had. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rebecca said eventually, "I've been thinking about something. All these months, watching how people respond to your story, seeing the impact it's had on education, I've been wondering if I should change careers." Eleanor looked at her with interest. "What do you mean, dear?" "I love nursing, and I'm good at it. But seeing how you've influenced so many lives, seeing how George and all your other students carry pieces of you with them, I think maybe I want to be a teacher. Maybe that's where I can make the biggest difference." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Rebecca Ann Foster, if you decide to become a teacher, you'll be extraordinary. You already have the most important quality. You care about people. Everything else can be learned." A car horn honked gently outside, signaling the arrival of their transportation to the school dedication. As Eleanor stood up, straightening her best dress, the same blue one with pearl buttons she had worn to George's concert, she felt a mixture of anticipation and reflection. The drive through Pearsall took them past landmarks of Eleanor's life. The small apartment where she had lived as a young teacher, the church where she and Robert had been married, the houses where many of her students had grown up. The town had changed over the years, but its essential character remained the same, a close-knit community where everyone looked out for each other and education was valued as the key to a better future. The elementary school parking lot was already filling with cars when they arrived. Eleanor could see news vans from several television stations, but she had grown accustomed to media attention over the past months. What moved her more were the clusters of people she recognized. Former students now in their 50s, 60s and 70s, former colleagues and current teachers from the district. "Eleanor!" called out Margaret Louise Patterson, Eleanor's longtime friend and teaching colleague. At 87, Margaret moved carefully but with determination, her face beaming with pride for her friend's recognition. As Eleanor made her way toward the school entrance, she was stopped every few steps by people wanting to greet her, to thank her, to share memories of their time in her classroom. James Robert Mitchell, the doctor from Houston who had been in her 5th grade class, had driven down with his own children to show them the school where their father had learned to believe in himself. Linda Sue Rodriguez, who had become a teacher inspired by Eleanor's example, brought 3 generations of her family to witness the dedication. "Mrs. Whitfield," said a voice behind her, and Eleanor turned to see George Strait approaching with his characteristic, humble smile. Even at 71, he still had the posture and presence of a star, but in his eyes, Eleanor could still see traces of the 8-year-old boy who had once been her student. "George Harvey," she said, using the full name that had become her trademark way of addressing him. "You look handsome in that suit." George laughed, embracing his former teacher gently. "You know, Mrs. Whitfield, I've been thinking about what I want to say today, and I keep coming back to something you taught me all those years ago. You said that our gifts aren't really ours. They're meant to be shared with others to make the world a little better." He gestured toward the crowd gathering around the school. "Look at what you've shared, Mrs. Whitfield. Look at all these people whose lives you've touched. This isn't just about one teacher and one student. This is about the power of education to transform communities, to change lives, to create hope." As they walked into the school together, Eleanor was struck by how different the building looked from her teaching days, yet how familiar it felt. The hallways were brighter, the classrooms equipped with modern technology, but the essence remained the same. A place where children came to learn and grow and discover their potential. The ceremony began in the school's gymnasium, which had been decorated with banners celebrating not just Eleanor's career, but the teaching profession as a whole. The program included speakers from the Texas Education Agency, the National Education Association, and the local school board, but the most moving moments came from Eleanor's former students. Dr. James Robert Mitchell spoke about how Eleanor had encouraged him to pursue science when he was struggling with reading comprehension. Mrs. Whitfield didn't just see my weaknesses, he said. She saw my curiosity. She helped me understand that there are many ways to be smart, many ways to contribute to the world. Linda Sue Rodriguez, now a veteran teacher herself, shared how Eleanor's classroom management style had influenced her own teaching philosophy. She never raised her voice, never made a child feel stupid or ashamed. She had this way of redirecting behavior that made students want to do better, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because they didn't want to disappoint her. But it was the words of Maria Elena Vasquez that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Maria had been one of Eleanor's students in the 1970s, a shy girl from a Spanish-speaking family who had struggled with English and felt out of place in the predominantly Anglo classroom. Mrs. Whitfield could have seen my limited English as a problem, Maria said, her voice strong despite her tears. Instead, she saw it as an opportunity. She learned some Spanish phrases to help me feel welcome. She paired me with bilingual students who could help translate. She celebrated my culture while helping me master a new language. Maria paused, looking directly at Eleanor. Mrs. Whitfield, you taught me that being different wasn't something to hide or be ashamed of. You showed me that my background was an asset, not a liability. Today, I'm a bilingual education coordinator, helping other children navigate the same challenges I faced. Everything I do in my career comes back to lessons you taught me about dignity, respect, and the value of every child. When it was time for Eleanor to speak, she walked slowly to the podium, looking out at the crowd of people whose lives had intersected with hers over the decades. The room fell silent, everyone leaning forward to hear what this remarkable woman would say. My dear friends, Eleanor began, her voice still clear and strong at 91. When I walked into my first classroom 68 years ago, I thought I was there to teach children about reading and arithmetic and history. What I discovered was that teaching is really about learning about each child's unique gifts, learning how to nurture their potential, learning how to believe in them even when they don't believe in themselves. She paused, scanning the crowd, her eyes stopping on faces she recognized from decades past. Every child who walked into my classroom taught me something new about patience, about creativity, about the resilience of the human spirit. You weren't just my students, you were my teachers too. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she continued. George Harvey Strait became a famous musician, and that's wonderful. But I'm equally proud of James, who became a doctor, and Linda, who became a teacher, and Maria, who helps other children find their voices. I'm proud of Tommy, who became a mechanic and kept our community's cars running. I'm proud of Susan, who raised 5 beautiful children and volunteered at the library for 30 years. Success isn't measured just in fame or fortune. It's measured in kindness, in contribution, in the positive impact we have on others. She looked directly at George, who was sitting in the front row. George Harvey, your success as a musician is remarkable, but what makes me most proud is the man you've become, generous, humble, grateful. The little boy who used to hum in my classroom grew up to share his gift with millions of people, to bring joy and comfort through his music, and now to support other children through education. That's the real measure of success. Eleanor concluded with words that would be quoted in education journals and teacher training programs for years to come. Teaching is not about creating carbon copies of ourselves. It's about nurturing the unique potential in every child, helping them discover their own gifts, their own path, their own way of making the world better. Every child is someone's whole universe. When we honor that responsibility, when we see each student as a gift to be treasured rather than a problem to be solved, we change not just individual lives, but the future itself. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but as it died down, George Strait stood up and walked to the podium. "Mrs. Whitfield, would you mind if I shared something with everyone?" Eleanor nodded, curious about what George had in mind. George pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Mrs. Whitfield, last week I received a letter that I think everyone here needs to hear. It's from a teacher in Ohio named Jennifer Williams. She wrote to tell me how your story had affected her classroom." He unfolded the letter and began to read. "Dear Mr. Strait, I want to thank you and Mrs. Whitfield for reminding me why I became a teacher. After watching your reunion and hearing her interviews, I realized I had lost sight of what teaching really means. I was so focused on test scores and meeting standards that I forgot to see the individual children in my classroom." George continued reading. "Yesterday, I noticed one of my struggling students, a boy named Michael, drumming rhythms with his pencil during math class. Instead of telling him to stop, I remembered Mrs. Whitfield's story about you humming in her classroom. After class, I asked Michael about his interest in music. It turns out he's been teaching himself to play drums by watching YouTube videos, but his family can't afford lessons." George's voice grew emotional as he read the letter's conclusion. "Today, I connected Michael with our school's music teacher, who has agreed to give him free lessons. I also started a program called Hidden Talents, where students can share interests and abilities that don't show up on standardized tests. Mrs. Whitfield, your story reminded me that every child has a song inside them. We just need to listen for it." The letter was signed by dozens of Jennifer Williams's colleagues, all teachers who had been inspired by Eleanor's story to look at their own students differently. George folded the letter carefully. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is just one of hundreds of similar letters I've received. Your story, our reunion, has reminded teachers across America to see each student as an individual, to look for the gifts that might not show up on tests, to believe in children the way you believed in me." As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to mingle, Eleanor found herself surrounded by current teachers from the district, all wanting to thank her and share how her story had influenced their own practice. Young teachers spoke about being more patient with struggling students. Veteran teachers talked about rediscovering their passion for education, and administrators discussed creating more supportive environments for both teachers and students. The documentary crew captured these informal conversations, understanding that they were witnessing the real impact of Eleanor's story, not just the famous reunion with George Strait, but the ripple effect that was changing classrooms and lives across the country. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found a quiet moment to walk through the school's hallways. The walls were decorated with student artwork and achievement certificates, just as they had been during her teaching days. But there were also new additions: quotes from Eleanor's interviews about believing in every child, photos from the reunion concert, and a display case containing memorabilia from her teaching career. In what had been her favorite classroom, the one where she had taught George and so many others, Eleanor paused at the door. The room had been transformed with new furniture and technology, but she could still picture it as it had been. Rows of small desks, alphabet strips around the walls, and the piano in the corner where she had led the children in songs. "Mrs. Whitfield?" "Uda," came a small voice behind her. Eleanor turned to see a current third grader, a little girl with pigtails and a shy smile. "Are you really the teacher who taught George Strait?" Eleanor knelt down to the child's level, something that took considerable effort at her age, but felt instinctive after decades of connecting with students. "I am, sweetheart. What's your name?" "Emma Rose Johnson," the girl replied. "My teacher, Mrs. Peterson, says you were the best teacher ever, and that you helped George Strait believe in himself." Eleanor smiled. "Well, I don't know about being the best teacher ever, but I did try to help all my students believe in themselves. Do you know what I think, Emma Rose?" The little girl shook her head. "I think you have special gifts inside you, just like George Harvey did, just like every child does. Maybe you're good at art, or math, or helping others, or telling stories. The important thing is to keep exploring, keep trying new things, and never give up on yourself." Emma Rose nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Peterson says the same thing. She says everyone is good at something different." "Mrs. Peterson is very wise," Eleanor replied, "and I bet she's a wonderful teacher too." As Eleanor stood up, Emma Rose impulsively hugged her legs. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield, for being so nice to George Strait. His music makes my grandpa happy." Walking back to the reception area, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction that had sustained her through 4 decades of teaching. This was what it was all about: connecting with children, helping them believe in themselves, planting seeds of confidence that would grow long after they left her classroom. The day's events concluded with a private dinner for Eleanor's closest friends, former colleagues, and family members. George and his wife were there, along with Rebecca and her family, Margaret Patterson, and several of Eleanor's most devoted former students. It was a quiet celebration, filled with storytelling, laughter, and the comfortable warmth of people who had shared meaningful experiences. As the evening wound down, George asked Eleanor if he could share one more thing with the group. "Mrs. Whitfield, when this whole story started, I thought it was about thanking you for what you did for me, but over these past months, I've realized it's about something much bigger." He looked around the table at the faces of people who had all been touched by Eleanor's influence in some way. "It's about recognizing that teachers are the unsung heroes of our society, that education is the foundation of everything we achieve, and that believing in a child, really seeing their potential and nurturing it, might be the most important work anyone can do." George pulled out a small wrapped package. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is from all of us, but especially from the thousands of teachers who have written to tell me how your story has inspired them." Eleanor unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a beautiful crystal apple with an engraving. "To Eleanor Catherine Whitfield, teacher, mentor, inspiration, your legacy lives in every life you've touched." But it was the accompanying letter that moved Eleanor most deeply. It was signed by over 5,000 teachers from all 50 states, all expressing gratitude for how her story had reminded them of the nobility and importance of their profession. As Eleanor read excerpts from the letter aloud, messages from teachers who had rediscovered their passion, who had started seeing their students differently, who had been inspired to believe in children the way she had believed in George, she realized that her story had indeed become something larger than one teacher and one student. It had become a reminder to an entire nation about the power of education, the importance of believing in children, and the ripple effects that occur when one person takes the time to see potential in another human being and nurture it with love and patience. 6 months earlier, Eleanor Whitfield had been a retired teacher living quietly in small-town Texas. Now she'd become a symbol of everything good about education, a reminder that teachers matter, and proof that the seeds planted in childhood can grow into something beautiful and lasting. But perhaps most importantly, her reunion with George Strait had sparked a national conversation about gratitude, the importance of thanking the people who help shape us, of recognizing the contributions others make to our success, and of never forgetting that we all stand on the shoulders of those who believed in us before we believed in ourselves. As Eleanor prepared to return home to her small house on Mesquite Street, she carried with her the knowledge that her life's work had been recognized and celebrated. But more than that, it was continuing to inspire and influence others. Teachers across America were looking at their students with new eyes, seeing potential instead of problems, nurturing gifts instead of focusing only on deficits. The circle that had begun in a third-grade classroom in Pearsall, Texas, had grown to encompass millions of people, all connected by the simple but powerful truth that believing in a child can change the world, one student at a time. Eleanor Catherine Whitfield, at 91, had lived to see that her life's work mattered, not just to one famous student, but to countless teachers and students whose lives would be forever changed by her example of what it means to truly educate a child. The legacy would live on in every classroom where a teacher looked past a student's struggles to see their potential, in every moment when an educator chose encouragement over criticism, and in every child who learned to believe in themselves because someone else believed in them first. And somewhere in America, there was another shy 8-year-old, struggling with reading or math or just fitting in, who would be blessed to have a teacher who remembered Eleanor Whitfield's story and chose to see not what that child lacked, but what they might become.